Hey folks, Loman02. Kind of been on a 93-94 old school tear over the last 48 hours. And I want to put this video up. So what I am doing here is I'm actually building a budget deck for a buddy that wants to play in a local event. Now, I say budget, though he'll be proxying the Black Lotus. The Moxen and the Black Lotus will be proxied in this deck. And he'll be allowed to play with other versions than the original art on the cards for this local event. So, this deck, this is RG Berserk, so this will be this friend of mine's first time playing in the format. Not historically a control player, typically either a combo or aggro player. So, my thoughts were, for a budgetary deck for him, it'd probably be easiest to go this route. I do think that Rug or like Quicksilver tends to be, a tad bit better, but you add blue to anything and then like the dollar value just goes way up because you're going to be playing the power blue cards. And, 5-color dreams or variations of 5-color dreams tend to also be more pricey decks, which probably would suit his playstyle, so he had an enjoyable time playing. This deck that you have here is RG Berserk. I built, I think, an older version or similar version of this, but it was more of a Quicksilver list. This list is intended for EC rule, so there is 4 strip mines in it. And then other than that, other than a higher mana count due to the fact that it is running 4 strip mines, so I mean, if you consider strip mine essentially as a spell, this is a 17 mana source deck to include the Moxen and the Black Lotus that'll be in there. Now, one of the curious things about this deck design, so a lot of this is not that original. You've probably seen RG decks, or a lot of the shell is kind of similar to Quicksilver list, with the exception of not running the blue cards and the Serendibs, and or like I think it's typically called Arabian Aggro. So there's a couple of things that I wanted to hedge in this deck, so that my buddy, didn't get blown out by certain cards. So I've kind of hedged between Arabian Nights original print cards and like Cards from the Dark, Core Set, and Antiquities, so that his threats such as Argothian Pixies, Elvish Archers wouldn't get blown out completely by a timely, possibly even main deck in some cases, City in a Bottle. So there are 4 threats that die to that. There will be no Cities of Brass in this deck. I through some testing I found the deck really doesn't need it. Right now the deck may be running 1 land heavy with the Llanowar Elf package that I have in it. But that's kind of another story, because that's an important card that I was going to discuss as we go through this, kind of one of the ones that makes it distinguishable from some other RG, like Berserk-style decks. So go down the list. You have your 4 Chain Lightnings, your 4 Lightning Bolts. Chain Lightnings oftentimes come out to replace with Red Elemental Blast, or that's at least in my theory crafting, the card that would typically be replaced by Red Elemental Blast, because typically the effect will just be more relevant to have Red Elemental Blast. You'll just buy more time, and your onboard creatures will do more damage, and you'll be stopping more important things. It's possible you even want 1 main deck, and maybe you look to cut something else in the deck. The deck does not have, outside of direct damage to creatures and or the opponent's face, really a lot of good interaction. So it does have 1 Scavenger Folk main deck, which is kind of just get a catch-all artifact. For instance, Nevin Jarl's Disc, etc. Just buy you that 1 turn. Otherwise, it's kind of on you as the player to play around those sort of effects as well as possible. But if you're worried about Nevin Jarl's Disc, you're probably doing it wrong, because this deck, if it's just basically fishing out against an opponent that doesn't have white mana available, because typically Nevin Jarl's Disc is used in non-white decks. Typically you can end the game pretty quickly because there's a ton of burn. Obviously, you have the Berserk package, you have the Giant Growth package, which all tends to work pretty well together. So, Chain Lightning, like I said, is templated Vice the sideboard with Red Elemental Blast. 4 Curd Apes. I mean, Curd Ape, it's in pretty much every single type or style of this style of deck, or every type of this style of deck. Lightning Bolt, 4 of them. I mean, it's the best, removal and direct damage in this color pie. Berserk. So I put 3 in there. Berserk's just a weird card. When you're playing against white, you're pretty much walking on glass the whole time you're waiting to use Berserk. You're essentially waiting for a big tap-out turn, and then you just dump your Berserks on something and just get the damage in there. It's essentially just a really good burn spell that has a very high opportunity for your opponent just to blow you out with removal. Giant Growth, I mean, it's in there to combine well with Berserk, and also, if your opponent gets cheeky and opts to block while you're attacking in with your smaller creatures into their Serendib Efreet that they resolve after your little creatures have been resolved, you can use Giant Growth just to get the thing out of the way, or, kill it in blocks. Same can be said for Elvish Archers. I kind of do like that card jumping a little forward, because it templates decently well against Knights, as does the Burn, but it also templates well against Serendib Efreet, because unlike all the other creatures that need to use Giant Growth to basically circumvent, or at least not 2-for-1 yourself with a Burn spell, Elvish Archers does combine well with Lightning Bolt to trade with stuff with 4 toughness like Serendib Efreet, or even in this case an Urnam Jin in a pseudo mirror match, or maybe even like an Armageddon or Ermageddon deck. So right now, the most contentious card for me is Llanowar Elves. One of the frailties of this specific deck, and you can see we've tried to address it to a bit in the sideboard, is Moat and the Abyss. The Abyss to a lesser extent. The Moat is kind of like Stone Cold. You're just done. Unless you're going to burn them out. So if you get all your damage in early and they drop a Moat and you're close enough, you could possibly get there. But I think it's going to have a lot of challenges against the Moat. The Abyss, you run 20 creatures in this deck, which is a decent few, although you do not have draw in this deck outside of Wheel of Fortune. So, typically speaking, you can lose a Llanowar Elves, and then you can lose, a Curd Ape, and then you're still attacking with, 2 or 3 down to 2, down to 1 creature. And generally speaking, it's going to be enough damage, unless it's, combined with, a couple Swords of Plowshares or something like that. So Llanowar Elves is the most contentious. I think to beat Moat, or if I wanted to more regularly beat Moat, I would probably want to either retain some number of Llanowar Elves or remove all Llanowar Elves to go for a Scrib Sprite, or go for Scrib Sprites to have an additional form of reach against Moat. That said, that's why the land count I think is still about 1 too high in the deck, because I've kind of been in between testing Scrib Sprites and Llanowar Elves. Obviously, with Scrib Sprites, it means your Urnam Djinns are a little bit less likely to come down on turn 3. Or even turn 2 if you have the Ruby or Emerald draw. Lotus, obviously, turn 1 is possible with it. But obviously, it does slow down Urnam Djinn, which can be problematic. But at the same time, it also gives you a viable means of reach in a recurring source of damage that marries up very well with the pump spells in the deck to get around Moat. So I think that's definitely a consideration. I do have 1 Scavenger Folk in there. It's kind of my concession to, hey, this is still a 1/1. It can still carry a Berserk. It can still carry a Giant Growth. But it can also deal with any artifacts that are in play, which, I think you want at least one of those effects, but I really didn't want to main deck a Shatter. You can see the sideboard does have some artifact hate, but we'll jump to that in a moment. Going to the next pile, we do have other quote-unquote artifact hate in the form of Argothian Pixies. Really, this card is just templated to get through, Juggernauts or block Juggernauts. It doesn't get killed by Triskelion, and the biggest one is it gets through Mishra's Factory, of which we are running 2. Already talked about Elvish Archers. They template decently well against White and Black Knight, or the Pump Knights, stuff like that may be problematic. But then again, you have Burn for those things, and Protection Black, Protection White is relevant, mostly Protection from White. There are precious few creatures that actually have protection from Red in 93-94, I believe, to include Repentant Blacksmith and, hold on here, Knights of the Thorn. Neither of which see a lot of play, or I have not seen either played. Wheel of Fortune. This is a deck that's going to, generally speaking, expend its cards relatively fast. Unless you're playing a close hand and you make a good read on your opponent having interaction, and you just don't want to try to go for the Berserk kill early because there's white man up or something like that. But typically speaking, because it's not this style of deck is not an unseen deck. Folks are going to try to blow you out and get 2-for-1s. So you basically have to just get them low enough to force them to use their interaction, and then once you get them tapped out because they are required to interact with your board, use your stuff to kill them. Urnam Djinns. I'm actually kind of on the fence about Urnam Djinn. I love the card for nostalgia's sake. There's a lot of great there's a lot of great reprints of this dude, so he's pretty cheap for my friend. And he's just huge, and he's cool. I don't know how great he is. 4 mana is still a lot for this deck, and because the primary plan is to hook up Giant Growths and Berserks, I like him a little less, but that said, he is one card that stands on his own, that is a threat that will end the game fast. Otherwise, other than the Curd Apes and the 2-drops, most of the 1-drops are not ending the game fast. This deck will attack with Land of Werewolves if it has to, which it often finds itself in places where it needs to. So, there are times where you kind of get some, like, anemic draws, or draws where, like I said, like, the opponent will leave up interaction. You just don't want to try to go for Giant Growths in the open. I mean, Giant Growth is not Lightning Bolt. You have to be much more careful with it, obviously. And I know you guys all know that. And Berserk, same way. I mean, it's just, I Giant Growth, double Berserk, a Land of Werewolves, for, what is that? Is it 8 damage? Oh, double Berserk, no, it'd be 16. But you do that, and like they just, in response, throw a Swords of Plowshares at it, and you're just kind of like, all right, I'm out of the game. I just dumped, 3 cards into this thing. I have a bunch of life, but, your life total doesn't really matter in this deck, because you're probably going to typically be desiring to play this against control decks. The other thing I kind of like about the red in the deck, well, there's a couple good things. Like, one, the mana works out in a way that, like, even though you're a cheaper deck, you can play Blood Moon in the sideboard, which is actually pretty awesome. Because I think, like, the Naya and the Quicksilver or the Rug style decks will tend to be more powerful because they have either blue or they have white for Disenchant Swords to Plowshares. But what you get when you give those color schemes up is you get Blood Moon because your mana should be more consistent. And while we do run all 4 Strip Mines, we run the Taigas, the Pendelhaven, the Hammerheim, the Mistress Factories. Like, if you turn those into mountains, it's not the end of the world. And your Strip Mines, unless you're drawing them after you drop a Blood Moon, probably were already used because this deck is not the sort of deck to try to sit on a Strip Mine. You're not trying to use it to, like, wait for them to tap down and then, like, interact with their mana on their end step so you can resolve something on your next turn. Like, you're not a control deck, like, so you're not using it like that. You're just kind of using it to buy tempo. It's ideally like a time walk in a way. So, there is that. So jumping to the sideboard, pretty... any deck that's red is going to run at least some number of red elemental blasts. This has 4, just because I think my friend who will be piloting this will be probably facing a lot of blue decks. Next up, you have the 3 Blood Moon package. Like I said, like what this deck loses out on in overall power from like losing out on white and blue, which I think are superior colors to red and green in 93, 94. You can make up for in Blood Moon because there are just certain decks that can't beat it. Like if you resolve it and they don't have open blue mana, so they can use a Beb or they can't counter it, they're going to lose to it. I also have 2 Shatterstorms because, the one deck that kind of worries me on this deck, at least in the pre-boarded game, is like the shop-style decks, like, turn 1... Turn 1, let's say, Mistress Factory into, like, Soul Ring, into Mox, into Triskelion, or some nonsense, or whatever it would take. That kind of stuff worries me with this deck. I mean, I do have a few hedge bets, like Argothian Pixies, that can kind of get around it. And those decks do tend to be less interactive, so, you may be able to get away with just using your Giant Growths and Berserks, like, and not have to worry about, like, Swords of Plowshares and whatnot. But at the same time, like, they're god-awful fast. This is a very efficient deck, but it is certainly not that fast on their best draws. On their average draws, your average draws are probably better than, like, Mishra's Workshop decks' average draws. And I say that because, like, their threat density is not going to come up right, or they're going to miss on Workshop, or they're going to get a busted Tron draw where it just doesn't work. And as long as you have, like, your 2 colors, which is pretty easy in a 21-land deck, you're going to be able to cast your spells, and all your spells pretty much do something, unless you just assess that the situation doesn't warrant using them, i.e. Berserk, Giant Growth. So, that said, I do have 2 Shatterstorms in here. I'm not convinced that it shouldn't be like 2 Shatters and 1 Shatterstorm, but I just went for overall power. This deck runs 3 artifacts. By the time you can cast a 4-drop, those artifacts are likely no longer relevant because you've probably expensed your hand and you're just using Shatterstorm to blow the board apart. Get rid of some problematic artifacts. In the next row, you have Tranquility and Shatter. Tranquility is a card that I hedge because I don't have the Scrib Sprite package in here right now to beat up on Moat. And it also gets the Abyss randomly, but Moat is really the problematic card. And then you've got 3 Avoid Fates. That's kind of just a templated card against white decks, because white decks can have Swords to Plowshares, and if you have this, it's kind of like an insurance policy against the Berserk Giant Growth plan, just to blow your opponent out in one fell swoop. So that is where I'm at right now in this deck. Like I said, I think in current configuration, it could probably drop 1 forest and still be very playable at 20 lands. 20 creature deck, so its threat density is extremely high, which I think is necessary in this style of deck because our card draw is just not there. We have, Wheel of Fortune. This deck does not play Library of Alexandria because I'll be playing at the event and I will be playing that card in my deck. And I cannot loan it to my buddy. So, and it doesn't play any Cities of Brass. So that all said, I mean, I do think that this deck, I tested this deck, and we're going to go into a game relatively soon, and I'll kind of show you what I found with it in one matchup. But I'm still on the fence, and I would like to hear your opinions on it if you're an old school aficionado or you played, a lot of RG, because this is not my style of deck. I mean, I can play this deck, and I think I can probably play it to around the 80th percentile. I think it's probably only built to like the 85th percentile. I think there's more tuning I need to find in it, and I'm not convinced there's other cards I don't want. Like Black Vice is kind of a card that's enticing right now. Scrib Sprites is the other one, and I'm sure there's more that'll come to mind. But those two kind of come to mind immediately because I'm like, yeah, it'd be really nice to have like turn one Vice and be like, go. That said, it's kind of non-bow with the Shatterstorm sideboard option, the Shatter possibly. I don't think I need to run like an Artifact Blast sideboard because I don't think that City in a Bottle is the Hail Mary that it typically would be against these style of decks like the Quicksilver ones. And because I've kind of dropped down I only have 8 cards that die to City in a Bottle, I feel pretty comfortable that like at any given time, like the most they're probably going to get me for if I'm piloting this deck is a 2-for-1, as opposed to like just a vast blowout where I can't play any more cards, unless I just draw, unfortunately, and draw like all three remaining Urnums in a row or something like that. But anyways, this is the build where it's at. I'm going to go to a quick pause, guys, and I'll jump into the gameplay. We played this deck against Mono White Workshop Prison. It's basically a Winter Orb deck. It runs quite a bit of anti-creature stuff. It's got the Swords to Plowshares package. It's got the Wrath of God package. I did not see the Moat, so I was kind of lucky not to see the Moat because, like I said, I think Moat is one of the tougher cards for this deck to beat. But I'm going to go to pause. I'll be right back, and you can see how this played out. All right, guys, so game one. We are on the play, which is cool. This hand's acceptable. Like, it would probably rather have one more creature. In the dark, it's keepable because, it can play its spells. Although, I would prefer to draw, like, Berserks and Giant Growths a little bit later on. But it's not a hand you throw back. And actually, the Pendelhaven makes it more keepable because the Pendelhaven can make the Elves actually attack for damage, which isn't bad. And if I ever get a third green source and they just tap out for something, I could go or I could make Land Werewolves a 2-power attacker, make it a 5-power attacker, and then make it a 10-power attacker, and just do half their life total in one turn. I do draw a Curd Ape, which is a phenomenal pickup, so I'm putting some pretty good pressure on my opponent. They play a Howling Mine out. Howling Mine is a card that I'm actually kind of happy to see. I think it's very rare that you want to leave a Howling Mine in play, but this deck, because it pretty much dies to Chalice of the Void, if that were a card in old school, it's pretty happy to see a Howling Mine because it's just going to run through its cards. It's not really a very economic deck, but it's very efficient. Like it just burns cards up. So I feel like unless they're really maximizing on Howling Mine, I'm probably going to be able to spend my cards. I could probably do it more efficiently than I have. I just haven't wanted to use Berserk and Giant Growth yet, especially with a Mox Pearl up. And as you saw, we did get a threat, Swords to Plowshare. Unfortunately, the Mox Pearl is not a Plains, because I would just kill that. I go ahead and get rid of their library here. I'm not convinced that was right. It could have been much more so correct to just get the Mishra's Factory. But I figure because I have Bolt, if they want to spend 2 mana to try to block, I can just blow that thing apart with the Lightning Bolt. And the only way I get really punished by that is if they drop a secondary Mishra's Factory, and then it just, it can become a 4 toughness thing. Well, there's a factory, so I'm a little punished. They're down to 4 cards, though. They're drawing off Jameday Tome, but they have an Ivory Tower in play, so they're going to gain 1 life next turn. I go ahead and bolt them, and they just pack it in. That must mean they don't have an additional Swords to Plowshares, and/or they just really don't want to block. But this is going to kill them if they don't have a Swords to Plowshares. They'll go down to 3, and then whatever they block with the factory is cool. It'll get blocked, and then I'll just Berserk the other thing. And if it's the Elf that gets through, then I'll Pendelhaven it, Berserk it, and hit them for 4, putting them to -1. So that is game 1. This RG budgetary 93-94 deck was able to get through the what appears to be like a Mono White Shops prison deck. But we didn't really see any of the prison element. My guess is it's probably a Winter Orb deck, and Winter Orb is probably not going to be exceedingly good against like Land of Werewolves deck. But we'll see what they have in game 2 and see how that game goes. So quick pause, guys. I'll be right back. All right, guys, back. So I took out the Erdem Djinns. I felt like they were just too slow for the deck, and I have rebuilt it from the list you saw. I only had 3 Urnums in at the time. What I ended up doing is just bringing in 1 Blood Moon, 2 Shatterstorms, and the Shatter. I took out Wheel of Fortune as well because I felt like they were probably a Winter Orb deck, and I wanted to get the most mana-efficient cards that I could so that if I only had 1 to 2 mana on any given turn, I would be able to cast my cards. And Erdem Djinn doesn't really lend itself to that, even though it's a decent-sized threat. But I really don't want to just get blown out. Like, spend 4 mana, get Winter Orbed, and have my Urnimjin dealt with for 1 mana. If they're playing Winter Orb, they likely hit, we are likely to see cards like Icy Manipulator, Relic Barrier, etc. They're just going to stop it. It's possible that I wanted to bring in some number of Avoid Fates as well, but in retrospect, I'm kind of glad I didn't, because I don't feel like they had enough removal that it really warranted me playing them. If they had like Lightning Bolts, Swords to Plowshares, etc., I think I would have, but I feel like I'm going to, because their mana is especially hinky, because they're running Workshop with a lot of cards that require double white mana, like Wrath of God, Moats, stuff like that. Oftentimes, I think their mana is going to struggle. That being the case, I think they're often going to have big tap-out turns where they're vulnerable to cards like Giant Growth and Berserk. So I actually opted to leave a Void Fade out just to see how this game would go. So I'm going to drop my sideboard here. This hand is very medium. It's lacking red mana, but it does have a bazillion Llanowar Elves that can attack through for some minute damage. I have a Strip Mine to just get rid of the Library of Alexandria, so they draw 0 cards off of it. Ivory Tower is kind of annoying, but I'll figure out a way to deal with it. I have a Shatter in hand. I have, a bunch of nonsense attackers. They're going to gain 1 off it this turn, though. They play out a Howling Mine, which I'm, generally speaking, pretty happy to see. Unfortunately for me, I don't hit my red mana source here. I get in for Lightning Bolt damage here, putting them down to 17. They draw off Howling Mine, play on a Jameday Tomes. They're back down to 4 cards. They're still not gaining life. I draw to a Taiga. What I opt to do here is just develop my board. I play on Argothian Pixies, Curd Ape, and I'm just attacking. I'm not seeing double white mana, so I'm thinking, if they have Wrath of God in their deck, which I have not seen to this point, then I'm not really that scared of it yet, unless they, just Lotus Go on me and just blow up a Wrath of God. So I'm just playing out creatures, because I don't really per se know what I'm up against, but I really want to be able to attack through their Mishra's Factory, and I prefer to use the bolts for face, because my creatures are kind of just interchangeable and not that great. They draw a card here. Unfortunately, I do not have a Shatter effect, or I do have a Shatter effect, I'm sorry, I don't have a Berserk effect or something like that, or a Pump effect. So I get another Curd Ape down. Unfortunately, this is where the Bad News Bears comes in. And I'm familiar with this deck. Now that I see what they're playing, I'm very familiar with this deck. It's basically just a white prison deck. It's a white orb, Propa, or not Propa. It's not a propaganda deck, but a white Winter Orb deck, prison deck. So there's a Berserk. That would have been nice a little while ago, but we did play into the Wrath. We didn't respect it, so this is a thing that can happen. I go ahead and blow up the Jameday Tome. This is more debatable. It possibly was more correct to blow up the Howling Mine here. But like I said, I'm so short on cards. I've been playing more cards than my opponent has, that I really don't feel bad with a Howling Mine in play. Now, if that had been a Mountain, obviously I won the game there, but because they have Mirror Universe, they're able to trade life totals, and I could have put them down to 1, but 1 was not going to get the job done here. That was going to be my life total by the time that they would get the turn back, so they would change life totals to Mirror Universe. I blow up the Mishra's Factory. I don't really have a good way to deal with Seera Angel. I draw for the turn off of the Howling Mine plus my draw, and realize that I do not have anything to defeat the Seera Angel. Not sure if Seera Angel was part of their board plan or if it's part of their main deck. But it certainly is interesting, and other than Urnimjin, it's pretty tough for me to deal with. However, because it's 5 mana, unless they have kind of a busted Lotus draw, it's going to be pretty tough for them to get it down turn 1, because their white mana is so choked. Vice, all of the colorless mana sources, the Strip Mines, the Mishra's Factories, the libraries, the workshops, etc., that it's pretty tough for them to get to double white, I think, on the correct or natural development timescale of when their lands would be dropped. So I think it's pretty tough, even by 5 to get it, because I think this deck is just much better at producing colorless sources than it is at producing white mana sources. And it still takes 2 turns of mana development to play 2 planes, right? So you're not getting down your Strip Mines, you're not getting down your workshops, you're not getting down your libraries if you're trying to get those white sources out early in order to play Seera on the correct timetable. Anyways, going to go on a quick break, guys. As you can see here, we just we played into the Wrath. I frankly wasn't sure if they were playing this deck or not. I probably should have been a little more reserved about how I played it, but I wanted to ensure that they were very dead on the next turn. So, I probably overplayed my hand. Anyways, guys, quick break, and we'll be back for round 3 with this RG experimental or building deck. Alright guys, back. This hand's acceptable. It's not great. So I have a Black Lotus. I make red mana. So here's my thinking. I don't have mana to cast the Chain Lightning. I'm just going to get it off now and put my 2-1 into play. And oh my goodness, am I glad that I did not use that Black Lotus to cast all of my creatures out, because I would be in a world of hurt. I would have lost 2 cards. So I get pretty lucky there. Tabernacle is not something that was unexpected, but they probably only run a Miser copy or a Singleton copy of it. But it does take them off a land drop for the turn, which is kind of nice because they're not producing mana with it. So again, another colorless source, or not even a colorless source, just another land that does nothing. That only impacts the board but does not produce mana. So again, like I'm not like 2 white mana is where I start getting scared. Yeah, they probably have Swords of Plowshares, but 2 white mana is where Wraths come in, is where Seer Angels come in, and those are cards that I can't really beat very easily. I just go ahead and tap my land. I don't think it's very likely that I'm going to draw something that requires all of this mana, so I can pay for the Llanowar Elves and force them to use their Icy. I do play out the Scavenger Folk. They cast out an Ivory Tower. The most important card, in my opinion, is Icy Manipulator, because I don't have a very high creature density right now, and I really want to get damage in. I just blow it up. I make a player here because I was talking on the phone at the time. I'm a dummy. I paid for the already sacrificed Scavenger Folk that had been used to destroy the Icy. So I have to pay another mana. But it's frankly irrelevant. I'm done on cards. I've got nothing in hand except for this Berserk, which doesn't really do anything with Llanowar Elves. This is a more question. Well, I do blow that up because I want to continue to attack. If they want to sit there and just build their hand size up and not play lands to get on the Ivory Tower plan, I think I'm okay with that because, in general, like I can just keep on playing, and like unless they're expended cards and I draw creatures, I'll probably still win that way. It's probably enough damage. So now it starts getting close. I've got them at 10 life. Last turn I could have 8'd them. I could have done 8. They're at 11 now. If they do not have Swords of Plowshares. But I am not willing to take that gamble, and 2 is not 0, or 2 life is not 0 life. And with an active Ivory Tower, I really don't feel like going down to 0 cards. I would prefer to like leave the information hidden. They can probably make a pretty good guess as to what kind of cards I have in hand. I'm playing all of my lands out because if I think I did bring the Wheel of Fortune back in on the play. If I draw Wheel of Fortune, I don't want to have any lands in hand. I want to play them all out. They're not playing blue, so you don't have to worry about Time Twister or Wheel from them, but there is Howling Mine, so I really don't want to have any lands. Plus, I also have Tabernacle opposing me right now, and Tabernacle is one of those cards that like it just behooves you to play your lands out because as you draw creatures, it's just going to provide you more resources to fuel the fire, so to speak. I just cast a Shatterstorm here to take them off a little bit of mana and ditch their Ivory Tower. I don't know if that was per se correct. I don't know what they were trying to do otherwise, though. Like, I think their hand might just be garbage here, because they're just not doing anything, and like they have the mana to do stuff, but to me what it feels like is they're trapped on a bunch of double white mana spells at this point in the game, and they just can't cast their stuff. Like, that's kind of what my feeling is, my inkling is. So I figure Mox Sapphire is a pivotal colorless source that can be used to cast non-artifact cards, and the Ivory Tower is just annoying, and I don't really have a threat on the board, so I prefer to have them stop gaining life. Alright, so Howling Mine comes down, and I'm like, alright, this is good. Like, I'm going to draw a threat, and then I've got double Berserk Giant Growth, which is, I believe, 20 damage on a 2/1 attacker. So drawn to Argothian Pixies and Mishra's Factory. The Factory is stone cold dead to the Strip Mine. So if I fire it up, I'm just expecting them to dump their Strip Mine in my lap and just throw it on the Factory. But, if I want to be ballsy, I could try to kill them this turn with the double Berserk and the Giant Growth. I'm not a gambling man, so I don't go that way. What I end up doing again is I just Shattering Storm again to blow up the Howling Mine to keep them off cards, because they're obviously looking for something. If they're not casting relevant stuff and they're playing draw cards, I think it's more relevant just to take the free draw step I got off of the Howling Mine and like take it away from them. So they draw into a land, and evidently they have drawn a Mirror Universe. When they tap out here, I start hooting and hollering because I have a win in hand. I pay for my Llanowar Elves, pay for my Argothian Pixies, and then end up firing up the Factory here and getting in for, I don't know, darn near 30 damage, something like that. That's a lot. Like, Berserk's kind of a silly card. All right, not 30, like 23. Forgot the rest of them don't get any cool stuff. So we managed to take it down against this white control deck. And I mean, look at the cards they're playing. I mean, that deck is a more pricey deck. So I didn't expect this deck to, I don't expect this deck to be like as good as like the deck or as good as like Quicksilver deck, stuff like that. Like, 'cause Quicksilver still doesn't run artifacts, and it gets energy flux, which just owns. But that all said, I do think this deck performed pretty well for what it is and the budget constraint that it's currently on. Versus a known archetype, which is White Prison. Like, this is a good deck. Like, I've played with White Prison, and I played against White Prison in quite a few events. It's a good deck. And this deck managed to hold its own through this game. And, I think I'm going to continue to refine it, but what I'd be interested to hear from you guys is, like, what do you think of the build? What other budgetary options do you think are worth considering in it? And there's a few questions I posed earlier, too. Like, do you think Llanowar Elves is worth it? Or maybe they're worth it in some number, but part of me is still kind of hung up on, like, are Scrib Sprites worth it just to defeat moats? I think by the time an opponent gets a moat down, like, Scrib Sprites, because there's only 4 of them in the deck, are probably just going to become Swords to Plowshares bait. But if you're lucky, I suppose they're still expending their Swords to Plowshares in the early game just to stay alive. So maybe that's not intrinsically true. And when I'm saying like I'm talking like control. Like, I'm just talking about beating control with this deck. In general, this deck's fast, so I mean it should be halfway decent against control. I just feel like, there's going to be games where it's going to be very tough to like spearhead and push through that last couple points of damage, and they're going to eventually, like when you have them down to 4 or 5 or something like that, start James Day Toming or Library of Alexandria, and they're going to get out of reach. So that's one of the things I'm kind of worried about. I feel like maybe some number of the Scrib Sprites should be in there. And, like I was saying, I also think that maybe the deck does require more artifact hate. It obviously has a bit sideboard. I mean, I got to Shatterstorm twice in this game. I wouldn't say they're the most powerful Shatterstorms, but I think they were better than Urnham Jinx. I think Urnham Jinx just, it's Swords to Plowshares bait, whereas all of these creatures that I have right now are just kind of innocuous little things that, you could blow up with Swords to Plowshares, but like, as you saw here, opponent was kind of just like, whatever, I'll put the Mirror Universe out and I'll change our life totals. And it's like, all right, cool, I got to tap out turn, you're dead. That's kind of the philosophy behind the deck. It's kind of just like an explosion deck. Anyways, guys, hope you enjoyed this old school content with this budget RG Berserk deck that I'm working on for my buddy. And leave some comments. Let me know what you think of the deck and what can be done better. All right, thanks, guys, and take care now.